the greatest challenge to their individuality that the Jews had ever faced.
They were a people who would reshape the world. They exalted the body's performance to the level of art. They built in a style simple and austere that would be copied forever. With the Greeks, seemingly for the first time, man put aside his preconceived notions and superstitions in order to use logic when he considered himself and his immediate world. This was the place, the time of endless curiosity. They were a people of poets, Homer and Sappho, and playwrights, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and above all of philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. The gods the Greeks served were believed to dwell beyond the mists of Mount Olympus. They were capricious, as likely to loose a thunderbolt as to tune a lyre. They were numerous, and often very human in their failings, their anger, and their willfulness. Athene, goddess of war and wisdom. Poseidon, master of the white horses of the sea. Apollo, archer and rider of the sun. And Pan, part man, part goat, the maker of fear in lonely places. The Greeks were colonizers, exploiters, traders, entrepreneurs. By the 5th century, the influence of Greek culture was felt throughout the Mediterranean. The Greeks were also formidable soldiers, well-disciplined, ruthless, and not reluctant to fight. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the world. By the time of Alexander's death in the year 323, the Greek way of life had been established all over the Near East. The Greeks thought of themselves as bringing civilization to the barbarians. Wherever they went, the Greeks brought with them their own environment, their language, their way of dressing, their music, their logic, and their theater. The Jews at first looked askance at this strange form of instruction and entertainment, but many soon found themselves seduced and became enthusiastic audiences. The Jews were influenced in other ways as well, in the architecture of their homes and public buildings, in their language, their dress and manners, and in their appreciation of beauty. In time, they might even set a Greek architrave above Corinthian columns to enclose the scrolls of the Torah. So great was the Hellenistic influence on the Jews that their Torah, the histories of their nation, their psalms, and the words of their prophets All of these had to be translated from Hebrew into Greek, because so many Jews now spoke only Greek. The volume that was produced in the 3rd century came to be known in the Hellenistic world as the Book, Biblos in Greek, the Bible. Many Jews now lived in foreign lands throughout the Hellenistic world. Over the next 2 centuries, large communities would develop at Sardis and Ephesus in Asia Minor, at Antioch, and at Alexandria in Egypt. The culture they experienced was vibrant, dynamic, and alien. These sketches, done by 19th century students of the Beaux-Arts in Paris, bring to life the extravagance of this Greek world. One of the largest of all Jewish communities outside Judah was that of Alexandria in Egypt. Several 100,000 Jews lived in the great port city, a haven for all the shipping of the Mediterranean. Barter and trade of its docks and markets was matched by a traffic in rumors, in stories of far-off places, and in newly minted ideas. Like all Greek cities, there were palaces and theaters, places for sport, for burial, for the arts, for the good life, for learning. There was the museum, organized like a university for the study of science, literature, and the fine arts. Students came there from all over the world to hear lectures from such as Euclid the mathematician and Pythias the geographer. And there was a library, the trustee of 700,000 manuscripts, together representing the accumulated wisdom of most of mankind. Jews throughout the Hellenistic world absorbed from the Greeks their devotion to learning. They immersed themselves in the study of their sacred texts.
Alexandria was a place of fusion. Its very existence indicated a new era in history. In Alexandria, the Hellenistic way of life and its intellectual concepts met the ideas of the Orient, principal among which was the singular Jewish concept, the profound and revolutionary belief in one God and a universal morality. The tension created by this meeting had enormous consequences for the Jews. The differences between their ways and the ways of the Greeks would splinter the practices of the Jewish people.
By the beginning of the 2nd century, Alexander the Great's empire had disintegrated into separate kingdoms. Judah fell under the sway of Syria. In Jerusalem, a group of priests, allied with the Syrians, set about to change the form of Judaism, to make it more Greek, less distinctive, to make the Jewish people like any other within the Greek world. This led to popular revolt. Revolt in turn provoked repression by the Syrians. Their king, Antiochus Epiphanes, sided with the Hellenists. He forced Jewish practices into the darkness. He forbade, under penalty of death, circumcision, observance of the Sabbath, and possession of a copy of the Torah. In the year 168 before the Common Era, he plundered the temple, ordered pagan sacrifices in every town, and tried to supplant the one God with alien gods and goddesses. He stationed troops in Jerusalem. They could not prevent rebellion. Antiochus had to send in more troops. The result was massacre. the rebels were driven into the Badlands, the hills of Judah, where they fought on. Their leaders were the Maccabees, Mattathias and his 5 sons. One of the sons, Judas Maccabee, the Hammer, took command of the Jewish resistance. Judas Maccabee's command grew from a desperate band hiding wherever it could to an organized force, to an army resolute and expert. After 3 years in the wilderness, it was strong enough to storm Jerusalem. The Maccabees defeated the troops garrisoned in Jerusalem and liberated the temple. The traditions of the people had triumphed.
Having won independence for all of Judea by force of arms, the Maccabees now established a line of high priests. They were supported by a conservative group who wished only to observe the strict letter of the law as defined in the Torah. The priests and their supporters became a single party known as the Sadducees. Their counterpart was a group known as the Pharisees. They were scholars, many of simple background, who taught among the people. They believed that the laws of the Bible were open to interpretation, open to discussion and analysis. Perhaps through them, Greek civilization had its greatest influence on the Jews. For they admired Greek logic, the subtlety of Greek thought, and they applied it to their own studies. It was the Pharisees who first proposed the resurrection of the dead and life after death as articles of faith. It was they who advocated the threefold duties of worship, charity, and study. Study, examination of the meaning of the word. For many, it was a public activity in schools and in the streets. For others, it was intensely private.
The members of the scholarly sect which lived here in Qumran are known principally for some documents which they hid for safety in these caves. Documents which were not found again for 2 millennia. The scholar's business was the unremitting study of the Torah. They eschewed private property, endured a rigid discipline, and lived in communal houses. So inflexible was their doctrine that it would not even allow their bowels to pursue their natural function on the Sabbath day. Some of them were celibate. In many ways, they were the first community of monastics in the Mediterranean world. The legacy of these solitaries was a vast collection of religious and theological documents, now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their survival into the 20th century would provide the oldest known copies of texts from the Hebrew Bible. From the book of Deuteronomy.
Therefore shall you lay up these words in your heart and in your soul, and bind them as a sign upon your hand, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes.
Among the objects found at Qumran were sacred amulets called phylacteries in Greek, tefillin in Hebrew. The devout wore them at all times. One was placed on the forehead between the eyes. The other was fastened on the left arm so that the words it contained rested on the heart. The phylacteries were a reminder of the continual presence of God. They contained excerpts from his laws. On the leather was incised the Hebrew letter Shin. The straps by which they were attached were knotted to form the Hebrew letters Daled and Yod, Shin, Daled, Yod, the letters of the sacred name Shaddai, the Almighty. So for the devout, what they carried next to their hearts and minds in every waking moment was a reminder of their covenant with God. But no amount of prayer rising from the deserts and barren hills of Judah could protect the Jews from a culture in which almost everything that was valued was purely material.
Romans, let others fashion bronze and living faces from marble. Let others track the planets with their instruments and predict when the stars will appear. Romans, never forget that government is your medium, that your art is to practice men in the habit of peace.
The Romans brought peace with a vengeance. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the world of imperial Rome stretched along both shores of the Mediterranean, eastward into Syria and Mesopotamia, in the process swamping Judah, which was refashioned into a Roman province, Judea. The Romans occupied Jerusalem in the year 63 BCE and set up a puppet government. Judea was now subject to imperial Rome. The brief span of Jewish independence that had lasted 100 years since the victory of the Maccabees was brought to an end. The Jerusalem of this day now had a population of hundreds of thousands. This was the heart of the Jewish world. Here was the temple. Here too were priests, the scholars, the teachers, the passionate advocates of the many branches of the Jewish faith. Some welcomed the Roman conquerors, hoping that Rome would bring stability to this country divided by sects and parties. Others saw the Romans as a punishment from God. Roman society was rigidly defined by class. The class that governed Judea was essentially bureaucratic, tax collectors, functionaries, men without imagination or conscience. They were used to rule and impatient of dissent. They built in Judea, as they built in all their conquered territories, as if they meant to stay. They brought with them their impressive talents as organizers, settlers, makers of permanence. In the year 37 before the Common Era, they set up a Jew as ruler in Judea. His name was Herod. He became a king of Judea, but never a king of the Jews. The Jews feared him at first and then hated him. He was a tyrant, adamant, ambitious, imaginative, merciless. Herod the king was a highly volatile mixture of policy and passion. He built cities whose foundations lasted into the 20th century. His name became a byword for cruelty. In fits of insane rage, he slaughtered his own wife and 2 sons. This was his palace at Jericho, one of many. A developer of massive projects, Herod transformed the appearance of Judea's chief cities. The money for all this came from taxes. Herod razed any towns that refused to pay and sold their inhabitants into slavery. Ruthless as he was, Herod never ceased trying to win the sympathy of the people. In times of famine, he even sold the crown jewels to buy grain for a starving populace. Although Herod was Jewish, he was never accepted by the people. They saw him as an ally of Rome, a usurper of the Jewish throne. There was no denying Herod's Roman ties. This aqueduct, 8 miles long, brought water to what was his greatest achievement, Caesarea, a city dedicated to his patron, Caesar Augustus. Herod took a minor anchorage and made it into a great port. The streets of the town and its drains were flushed by the movement of the tides. The city boasted a racetrack, an amphitheater for 20,000 people, a courthouse, a theater, and rising above the city, a temple to Augustus that could be seen far out to sea. Caesarea was cosmopolitan and elegant, but it was a city in contention between pagan and Jew. Herod's construction of pagan cities in the land further fueled the people's resentment against their king. Under Herod, even the priesthood of the temple in Jerusalem was corrupt. The office of high priest itself was bought and sold. But when Herod decided to rebuild the temple, the priests became suspicious. They protested, but were overcome. Herod proceeded with his grand design. The priests had said that their faith required that no sound of hammer and chisel be heard in the temple precincts during the construction, clearly requiring a miracle. Herod had the stone quarried elsewhere and carted in silently. The priests had said that only they could undertake the work, and they unfortunately had no skills as artisans. Herod set up a training program for the priests, and before long, 1,000 priests were employed in construction. The architectural triumph of the whole grand design was the magnificent colonnades with marble Corinthian columns 50 feet high. The great outer court was open to everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, women as well as men. It was as much a market as a holy place. The inner courtyard was the place of assembly for worship, and women were accommodated there in galleries along its sides. The sanctuary enclosure was reserved to Jewish men. The sanctuary itself, of course, was the exclusive province of the priests. Herod's temple could claim its place among the wonders of the world. It was said that from a distance, because of the profusion of its white marble, it glittered like a snow-covered mountain. What the temple really stood for was something Herod could not comprehend, or chose not to. The desire of the people was for a way of life made holy through justice and an understanding of God's will. Understanding. This could be arrived at only through learning and the study of their sacred. The Greeks were also formidable soldiers, well-disciplined, ruthless, and not reluctant to fight. Alexander the Great, conqueror of the world. By the time of Alexander's death in the year 323, the Greek way of life had been established all over the Near East. The Greeks thought of themselves
as the greatest challenge to their individuality that the Jews had ever faced.
They were a people who would reshape the world. They exalted the body's performance to the level of art. They built in a style simple and austere that would be copied forever. With the Greeks, seemingly for the first time, man put aside his preconceived notion. Apollo, archer and rider of the sun. And Pan, part man, part goat, the maker of fear in lonely places. The Greeks were colonizers, exploiters, traders, entrepreneurs. By the 5th century, the influence of Greek culture was felt throughout the Mediterranean. And superstitions in order to use logic when he considered himself and his immediate world. This was the place, the time of endless curiosity. They were a people of poets, Homer and Sappho, and playwrights, Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, and above all of philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. The gods the Greeks served were believed to dwell beyond the mists of Mount Olympus. They were capricious, as likely to loose a thunderbolt as to tune a lyre. They were numerous, and often very human in their failings, their anger, and their willfulness. Athene, goddess of war and wisdom. Poseidon, master of the white horses of the sea.